The morning mist clung to the wheat fields of northern France like a shroud, and through it came the desperate roar of damaged engines. October 23, 1943. The American B-24 Liberator limped across the countryside, trailing black smoke and losing altitude fast. Its port wing was shredded by flak from the Luftwaffe fighters that had savaged the bombing formation over the Ruhr Valley just minutes before. Inside the cockpit, Lieutenant Dashiell Kravitz fought the controls as hydraulic fluid painted the instrument panel crimson. Behind him, his crew of 9 men braced for impact, their bomber now a 30-ton projectile seeking Earth. Below, in the village of Sainte-Marguerite-sur-Avre, a weathered farmer named Cyprien Beaumont looked up from his morning milking and watched death fall from the sky. The aircraft struck his furthest pasture with a sound like thunder splitting stone, cartwheeling through the fence line and coming to rest in a twisted heap of aluminum and dreams. Cyprien dropped his milk pail and ran toward the wreckage, his boots splashing through puddles, still warm from yesterday's rain. What he discovered in that smoking ruin would force him to make a choice that defied every survival instinct, every lesson learned under 3 years of Nazi occupation. He would have to choose between the safety of his family and the lives of 10 American strangers. No one in the village of Sainte-Marguerite-sur-Avre knew that one farmer's impossible decision that October morning would rewrite the rules of resistance and survival, turning a simple dairy operation into the most audacious hiding place in occupied Europe. Cyprien Beaumont had never wanted to be a hero. Born in 1898 to a family that had worked the same 120 acres for 6 generations, he learned early that survival came through quiet persistence, not dramatic gestures. His father, Anatole, had survived the trenches of the Great War by keeping his head down and following orders. Returning to Sainte Marguerite with a Distinguished Service Cross he never displayed, and memories he never shared. Young Cyprien absorbed these lessons, growing into a man who measured success by the health of his livestock and the yield of his grain fields. He married Solange Dubois in 1924, a union that produced 3 adult offspring who had scattered across France before the current war began. His farm supported 12 dairy cows, 48 sheep, and a rotating crop of wheat, barley, and sugar beets that fed half the surrounding communes in good years. When the Germans swept across France in 1940, Cyprien watched the panzer columns roll past his gates with the same stoic expression he wore during drought years or cattle plague. The occupation meant quotas and inspections, Wehrmacht trucks collecting grain and livestock for the Reich, but it also meant survival for those smart enough to adapt. Cyprien learned to hide his best milk cows in the forest during German sweeps, to bury grain in waterproof containers beneath his root cellar, to smile and nod when Obergefreiter Klaus Mannheim arrived for his weekly inspections. He mastered the delicate balance between compliance and resistance that kept rural families alive under the swastika. His neighbors considered him reliable, unimaginative, and utterly predictable. None of them suspected that behind his weathered features and methodical routines lay a mind capable of engineering the impossible. He had no idea that soon those instincts would be all that stood between 10 American airmen and the firing squads of Stalag Luft. The autumn of 1943 marked a turning point in the air war over Europe. Allied bombing campaigns had intensified dramatically, with flying fortresses and liberators crossing the Channel daily to strike industrial targets deep in the Reich. The 8th Air Force alone was launching raids of 500 aircraft or more, each mission a desperate gamble against Luftwaffe interceptors, radar-guided flak, and the unforgiving mathematics of aerial combat. For every successful bombing run, Allied commanders accepted losses that would have been catastrophic in any previous conflict. On average, 1 in 10 bombers failed to return from missions over Germany, their crews of 10 men each representing 90 lives, lost for every successful strike against enemy infrastructure. The psychological toll on surviving airmen was immense, with many completing their required 25 missions only to volunteer for additional tours rather than return to civilian life, haunted by the memories of friends who never came home. Lieutenant Dashiell Kravitz and his crew were part of this grim calculus, flying their 13th mission aboard a B-24 named Prairie Rose after Kravitz's hometown in Nebraska. Their target that October morning was the synthetic oil plant at Gelsenkirchen, a facility producing 15,000 barrels daily for the German war machine. Intelligence reports indicated light fighter resistance and minimal flak coverage, but intelligence reports had been wrong before. The reality was a coordinated assault by 37 Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf 190 attack fighters that turned the morning sky into a meat grinder of tracers and twisted metal. Of the 247 liberators that crossed into German airspace that morning, 31 would never return to their bases in England. Prairie Rose was damaged over the target, but managed to drop its bomb load before turning toward home, hydraulics failing and port engines streaming oil across the wing. The crew nursed their wounded bomber across the Low Countries and into northern France before physics finally claimed its due, bringing them to Earth in Cyprien Beaumont's pasture with a violence that should have killed them all, but somehow left 8 of the 10 men alive and desperate for sanctuary in a land where American uniforms meant immediate execution. The impact threw Cyprien to his knees 50 yards from the crash site, the concussion wave rolling across his fields like an invisible fist. Steam rose from the wreckage as aviation fuel mixed with morning dew, creating a chemical fog that burned his lungs and stung his eyes. He approached cautiously, expecting to find only corpses in the twisted aluminum, but movement in the cockpit proved him wrong. Lieutenant Kravitz hung upside down in his pilot's seat, blood streaming from a scalp wound, but his eyes alert and tracking. Behind him, the surviving crew members were extracting themselves from the bomber's broken spine with the mechanical efficiency of men trained for exactly this emergency. Technical Sergeant Bram Kowalski, the flight engineer, had a compound fracture of his left arm, but was already directing the evacuation of classified materials. Ball turret gunner Private Ezekiel Hutchins was unconscious but breathing, his legs pinned beneath a section of twisted fuselage. Navigator Second Lieutenant Roscoe Talmadge clutched his broken ribs and tried to destroy his maps and charts before enemy forces arrived. Cyprien watched this desperate choreography and understood with crystalline clarity that he stood at the crossroads of his life. He could walk away, report the crash to the local German garrison, and return to his cows and crops with his conscience clear and his family safe. Or he could step forward and embrace a madness that would endanger everyone he loved for the sake of 10 strangers who represented everything the occupation forces despised. The mathematics of the choice were simple and brutal. Hiding Allied airmen meant death by firing squad for his entire family if discovered. The Germans had made this policy explicit through public executions in nearby villages, posting photographs of French families shot for harboring enemy personnel. But looking into Lieutenant Kravitz's eyes as the pilot struggled free of his harness, Cyprien saw something that transcended rational calculation. He saw the same determination that had driven his father across the killing fields of Verdun, the same stubborn refusal to surrender that had sustained 6 generations of Beaumonts through revolution, invasion, and war. Without speaking, he stepped forward and began pulling the Americans from their metal tomb, knowing that this single act would transform him from an anonymous farmer into the most wanted man in 3 departments. What happened next shattered 45 years of careful living and launched the most audacious deception in the history of occupied France. The immediate challenge was not rescue, but concealment. German patrols would investigate the crash site within hours, following reports from collaborators or simply responding to the sound of impact that had echoed across the countryside like a thunderclap. Cyprian had perhaps 90 minutes to hide 10 Americans and the evidence of their survival before Wehrmacht soldiers arrived with orders to capture or kill any survivors. The crashed bomber itself was impossible to move, its bulk embedded 3 feet deep in soil that would require heavy machinery to extract. But machinery left evidence, and evidence meant death. Instead, Cyprian made the first of many impossible decisions that would define the months ahead. He would not hide the Americans from the crash site. He would hide them in plain sight. His dairy barn stood 400 yards from the pasture where Prairie Rose had died, a structure built by his grandfather in 1887 from local stone and hand-hewn oak beams. The building measured 60 feet by 120 feet, with a hayloft that could hold 3 seasons of feed and a ground floor divided into milking stalls, equipment storage, and workshops that had served the Beaumont family for over half a century. More importantly, the barn contained a root cellar excavated during the Franco-Prussian War of 1870, when Cyprien's great-grandfather had hidden grain from German requisition teams. The cellar extended 25 feet beneath the barn floor, supported by fieldstone walls and accessed through a trapdoor concealed beneath a heavy workbench. Cyprien had expanded this space during the early months of occupation, creating chambers that could hold livestock feed, farm equipment, and other valuables away from German inspections. Now he would use these hidden spaces for a purpose his ancestors could never have imagined. Working with desperate efficiency, he and the mobile Americans carried their wounded comrades across the pasture and into the barn, where Solange waited with medical supplies and blankets gathered from the house. She had watched the crash from their kitchen window and understood the implications without explanation. Her husband's decision became her decision, their family's survival now dependent on their ability to sustain an impossible lie for an unknowable duration. Together they established the Americans in the hidden cellar, creating a living space that would need to support 10 men for weeks or possibly months, while German forces searched the region for evidence of survivors. The technical challenges were staggering. 10 men required 3,600 calories daily, or over 100 pounds of food per month. They needed fresh water, medical care, sanitation facilities, and enough ventilation to prevent carbon dioxide poisoning in the confined space. Most critically, they needed absolute silence during daylight hours when German patrols, French collaborators, or simple neighbors might visit the farm for legitimate business. Cyprien solved each problem through modifications that pushed his engineering skills far beyond anything learned in agricultural work. The ventilation system became his masterpiece of improvisation. Using lengths of clay drainage tile buried 18 inches underground, he created air channels that connected the cellar to exhaust points concealed in haystacks 200 yards from the barn. The Americans could breathe fresh air without creating the telltale warm vapor clouds that would betray their presence during winter months. Water came from a hand-dug well that Cyprien deepened by 15 feet, installing a manual pump system that drew from an aquifer below the water table, monitored by German engineers. Food presented the greatest challenge, as 10 additional mouths would quickly exhaust reserves meant for a family of 2. Cyprien solved this through what he called mathematical farming, calculating precisely how much additional grain and vegetables he needed to produce without triggering suspicion from German quota inspectors. He expanded his garden plots by 20%, claiming increased personal consumption due to reduced meat rations. He traded dairy products with neighboring farmers for grain, potatoes, and preserved foods, creating a surplus that fed his hidden guests without depleting his own family's supplies. Most ingeniously, he established the Americans as seasonal workers in his mental accounting, distributing their food through small portions added to regular meals rather than obvious special preparation. Solange became expert at cooking for 12 people while appearing to cook for 2, a skill that required precise timing and careful management of leftovers. The medical challenges nearly defeated them in the first week. Private Hutchins required surgery for his leg injuries, a procedure that Cyprian performed with veterinary instruments and guidance from Technical Sergeant Kowalski, who had received field medic training before joining his bomber crew. They operated by lamplight in the hidden cellar, using precious morphine from the bomber's medical kit and praying that infection would not claim a life they had risked everything to save. Lieutenant Kravitz's head wound required daily cleaning and bandaging, while Sergeant Kowalski's broken arm needed professional splinting that Cyprian improvised using wooden boards and leather straps designed for livestock harnesses. The Americans adapted to their underground existence with the same efficiency they had shown in combat, establishing duty rosters, maintaining equipment, and preparing for the day when they might escape occupied France and return to their units. But as October became November and German patrols continued their methodical searches, it became clear that escape was not a realistic option. The Americans would spend the winter in the Beaumont barn, their survival dependent on a deception that grew more complex and dangerous with each passing day. The German investigation began 3 hours after the crash, led by Hauptmann Friedrich von Steuben of the Sicherheitsdienst, the SS intelligence service responsible for tracking Allied airmen in occupied territories. Von Steuben was a methodical officer who understood that successful escapes encouraged resistance activities and undermined German authority throughout the region. His team included 12 soldiers, 2 Gestapo interrogators, and a pack of German shepherds trained to track human scent through rural terrain. They established a command post in the village school and began systematic interviews with every resident within 5 kilometers of the crash site, seeking information about American survivors or evidence of local assistance. Cyprian submitted to questioning for over 3 hours, maintaining the persona of a simple farmer concerned only with crop damage and livestock safety. He reported seeing the bomber crash, but claimed to have found only corpses when he investigated, a story corroborated by carefully planted evidence at the crash site. The Americans had left behind 2 bodies, airmen killed instantly in the impact, and these corpses provided the physical proof von Steuben needed to support claims of total crew fatality. Cyprian also reported damage to his pasture and requests for compensation, bureaucratic concerns that reinforced his image as a man focused on practical rather than political matters. But von Steuben was not convinced. Intelligence reports indicated 10 crew members aboard Prairie Rose, and only 2 bodies had been recovered from the wreckage. Standard procedure required continued investigation until all personnel were accounted for, either as corpses or prisoners. The search expanded to include neighboring farms, abandoned buildings, forest camps, and known resistance safe houses throughout the region. German soldiers conducted daily patrols past the Beaumont farm, sometimes stopping to inspect buildings or interview the family about suspicious activities. Each visit represented a potential catastrophe that required perfect performance from everyone involved. Cyprian developed elaborate routines to mask any evidence of his additional occupants, while Solange created explanations for increased food consumption, unusual cooking smells, and subtle changes in their daily schedules. The Americans remained silent in their hidden cellar during these inspections, breathing through the concealed ventilation system and communicating through hand signals that prevented even whispered conversations. The psychological pressure was enormous, as 10 men lived in constant awareness that a single mistake would result in execution for everyone who had helped them. Winter brought new challenges that tested every aspect of Cyprian's deception. Heating the hidden cellar without creating smoke signatures visible to German patrols required innovative solutions that pushed his engineering abilities to their limits. He installed a heating system based on heated stones that could be warmed in the barn's legitimate fireplace and transported to the cellar through specially designed passages. The Americans learned to manage their body heat through shared blankets and carefully planned physical activity that maintained circulation without generating noise. Food preservation became critical as fresh supplies grew scarce and German rations reduced civilian access to meat, dairy products, and imported goods. Cyprian adapted traditional preservation techniques for the unique requirements of feeding 10 men in secret, creating smokeless drying systems and fermentation processes that produced nutritious food without telltale odors. The Americans contributed their own expertise to these challenges, with Technical Sergeant Kowalski proving particularly skilled at improvising mechanical solutions from available materials. Together, they created a ventilation system that recycled air efficiently, a waste management system that prevented contamination and odor, and communications methods that allowed coordination between the cellar and the barn above, without creating sounds that could be detected by visitors. The isolation took its psychological toll on everyone involved. The Americans struggled with the transition from active combat roles to complete passivity, while Cyprien and Solange lived in constant tension between their normal routines and the secret that could destroy them at any moment. They developed elaborate codes and signals that allowed communication between the surface and the hidden chamber, creating a language of subtle sounds and movements that conveyed complex information about German patrols, visitor schedules, and daily logistics. Lieutenant Kravitz proved especially valuable in organizing the Americans' daily routines, maintaining military discipline and morale in circumstances that would have broken lesser men. He established duty schedules, physical fitness programs, and educational activities that kept his crew mentally sharp and prepared for eventual escape opportunities. But as winter deepened and German searches continued, it became clear that escape would not come before spring, and possibly not even then. The Americans were settling into a long-term existence that none of them had anticipated when they climbed aboard Prairie Rose for what should have been a routine bombing mission over the Reich. By January of 1944, the deception had become a way of life that integrated seamlessly into the farm's daily operations. Cyprian had expanded his role from farmer to logistical coordinator, managing the complex requirements of maintaining 10 additional people without creating evidence that could be detected by increasingly suspicious German authorities. The Americans had adapted to their underground existence with remarkable efficiency, creating workshops where they repaired farm equipment, produced tools and household items, and even began manufacturing components for radio equipment that could eventually enable communication with Allied forces. Technical Sergeant Kowalski proved particularly gifted at mechanical innovation, creating improvements to Cyprien's milking equipment that increased dairy production and provided legitimate explanations for unusual sounds and activities in the barn. The increased productivity also helped manage the food requirements for their expanded population, as higher milk yields could be traded for grain and vegetables that sustained everyone through the harsh winter months. Lieutenant Kravitz established an intelligence network that monitored German patrol schedules, troop movements, and local security measures through careful observation and conversation with visitors to the farm. This information proved invaluable in planning activities and avoiding detection during periods of heightened surveillance. The Americans also began training local resistance members in demolition techniques, weapons handling, and tactical planning that would prove crucial for future operations against German forces. But these activities carried enormous risks, as any discovery would not only doom the Americans and the Beaumont family, but would also implicate dozens of French civilians in active resistance against the occupation. Cyprian found himself transforming from a simple farmer into a resistance coordinator, managing communications between different groups and providing sanctuary for other Allied personnel who had been shot down over the region. By spring, his operation had expanded to include 4 additional British airmen and 2 American pilots, creating a hidden population of 16 Allied personnel living beneath his barn in conditions that defied every principle of common sense and self-preservation. The technical challenges of supporting this many people in secret pushed his improvisational abilities far beyond anything he had thought possible, requiring constant innovation and adaptation to prevent discovery by German forces who were becoming increasingly frustrated by their inability to account for missing Allied airmen in the region. The breakthrough that would ultimately save them came from an unexpected source. Sergeant Kowalski's mechanical expertise had attracted attention from neighboring farmers who began requesting repairs and improvements to their own equipment, creating opportunities for intelligence gathering and resource acquisition that strengthened the entire operation. Through these contacts, Cyprian learned that the local resistance network was planning a coordinated uprising to coincide with the anticipated Allied invasion of northern France. The Americans could contribute their military expertise to these preparations, providing training and tactical advice that would dramatically improve the effectiveness of civilian fighters. But this also meant exposing the secret that Cyprian had guarded so carefully for over 6 months, trusting the lives of everyone involved to a broader network of French civilians whose security practices were unknown and whose loyalty was assumed rather than proven. Lieutenant Kravitz supported the decision, arguing that their military knowledge could save hundreds of lives during the coming battles, but the risk was enormous. Any breach in security would lead German forces directly to the Beaumont farm and the discovery of the most successful escape and evasion operation in occupied Europe. Cyprian made the decision to proceed, understanding that isolation no longer provided adequate security as German investigations intensified and resources became increasingly scarce. The transition from hidden sanctuary to active resistance base required careful planning and gradual expansion that maintained operational security while enabling the Americans to contribute their expertise to preparations for liberation. They began training French fighters in small groups, teaching weapons handling, demolition techniques, and tactical coordination that would prove crucial when Allied forces finally landed in Normandy. These activities represented the culmination of Cyprian's transformation from anonymous farmer to resistance leader, a role that required skills and courage he had never imagined possessing when he first approached the wreckage of Prairie Rose 8 months earlier. The Allied invasion of Normandy on June 6, 1944, marked the beginning of the end for German occupation in northern France, but it also created the most dangerous period for the hidden Americans and their French protectors. German forces retreating from the advancing Allied armies were desperate to prevent any assistance to advancing troops, conducting brutal reprisals against French civilians suspected of resistance activities. Execution squads operated throughout the region, killing entire families and burning farms suspected of harboring Allied personnel or supporting resistance operations. Cyprian's expanded network made his farm a high-priority target for these sweeps, as German intelligence had identified unusual patterns of activity that suggested significant resistance coordination. The Americans prepared for their final test, ready to defend their sanctuary against German forces while coordinating with advancing Allied troops to ensure their rescue rather than their destruction. The months of careful preparation paid off as Lieutenant Kravitz established radio contact with advancing American forces, providing intelligence about German defensive positions and requesting extraction for his crew and the French civilians who had risked everything to keep them alive. The rescue operation required careful coordination between advancing ground troops and local resistance fighters, with Cyprian's farm serving as a command post for activities throughout the region. Technical Sergeant Kowalski's mechanical expertise proved crucial in preparing demolition charges that would deny strategic bridges and crossroads to retreating German forces, while the other Americans provided tactical advice that helped French fighters achieve maximum effectiveness with minimal casualties. The operation culminated on August 12, 1944, when elements of the 3rd Armored Division reached Sainte-Marguerite-sur-Avre and discovered the most successful hiding operation in the history of occupied Europe. The Americans emerged from their underground sanctuary after 10 months of concealment, their survival a testament to one farmer's impossible decision and the engineering skills that had made that decision sustainable through the darkest period of occupation. German forces had searched for them continuously throughout their captivity, never suspecting that their quarry lived literally beneath the feet of soldiers who had inspected the Beaumont farm dozens of times during their methodical investigations. The liberation brought recognition that Cyprien had never sought, and attention that made him profoundly uncomfortable. Military intelligence officers documented his hiding system in detail, studying the engineering innovations and logistical solutions that had enabled such a large-scale deception to succeed for so many months. The concealed cellar became a textbook example of civilian resistance capabilities, with detailed reports forwarded to resistance training programs throughout liberated Europe. Lieutenant Kravitz and his crew provided testimonials that credited Cyprien with saving not only their lives, but also the valuable intelligence they had gathered about German operations during their months of observation. The Americans had used their concealment period productively, documenting German patrol schedules, supply routes, and defensive preparations that proved invaluable to advancing Allied forces. Their intelligence contributions were estimated to have shortened the regional campaign by several weeks and prevented hundreds of casualties among Allied troops. But Cyprien deflected attempts to celebrate his achievement, insisting that he had simply done what any decent person would do when confronted with human suffering. He returned to his farming operations with the same methodical focus he had applied to hiding 16 Allied airmen, rebuilding his damaged pastures and restoring his dairy operations to pre-war productivity levels. The hidden cellar was sealed and covered, its location marked only by a small stone monument that acknowledged the courage of those who had risked everything for others. Solange resumed her household routines with the same efficiency she had shown during the dangerous months of concealment, though neighbors noted that she never again complained about the ordinary stresses of farming life. The experience had taught both of them that survival often depended on capabilities they had never suspected they possessed, and that ordinary people could achieve extraordinary things when circumstances demanded courage rather than compliance. Their example inspired similar operations throughout liberated France, with dozens of farms and rural properties adapting Cyprien's techniques to hide Allied personnel and coordinate resistance activities. The impact extended far beyond their immediate region, as detailed reports of their success influenced Allied planning for operations in other occupied territories, where civilian cooperation could make the difference between failure and success. The post-war years brought a quiet satisfaction that Cyprien valued more than any official recognition. Letters arrived regularly from the Americans he had hidden, sharing news of their families, careers, and the ways their war experience had shaped their peacetime lives. Lieutenant Kravitz became a commercial pilot, crediting his months of enforced patience in the hidden cellar with teaching him the calm persistence required for civilian aviation. Technical Sergeant Kowalski opened a manufacturing business specializing in agricultural equipment, applying the improvisational skills he had developed during his underground captivity to civilian engineering challenges. Several of the Americans visited France regularly, bringing their wives and offspring to meet the farmer who had saved their lives and changed their understanding of human courage. These visits became annual traditions that continued for decades, creating lasting bonds between families separated by geography but united by shared experience of humanity's capacity for sacrificial love. Cyprian's farming operations prospered in the post-war boom, though he never expanded beyond the scale he had managed during the occupation years. His innovations in dairy production and crop rotation became models for agricultural modernization throughout the region, but he remained focused on sustainable practices that preserve the land for future generations. The local community gradually learned details of what had happened at the Beaumont farm during the occupation, though Cyprian discouraged attention and refused interview requests from historians and journalists. He preferred that the focus remain on the Americans who had shown such remarkable adaptability during their captivity, and on Solange, whose partnership had made the entire operation possible. The story became part of local folklore, told to demonstrate that ordinary people could achieve impossible things when motivated by conscience rather than self-interest. Children in the village learned that heroism often looked like quiet persistence rather than dramatic gestures, and that the most important battles were sometimes fought in hidden places by anonymous people who never sought recognition for their courage. The lesson resonated far beyond Sainte-Marguerite-sur-Avre, inspiring similar acts of civilian courage throughout Europe during the Reconstruction years, when communities struggled to rebuild societies based on cooperation rather than coercion. The mathematics of courage revealed truths that no military manual could capture. One farmer's decision to risk everything for 10 strangers had created a cascade of consequences that extended far beyond the immediate rescue of Allied airmen. The intelligence gathered during 10 months of careful observation had contributed to military operations that saved hundreds of lives and shortened the war by measurable periods. The engineering innovations developed to sustain hidden populations had influenced civilian resistance techniques throughout occupied Europe, enabling similar operations that multiplied the impact of civilian courage against military occupation. Most importantly, the example had demonstrated that ordinary people possessed capabilities they never suspected until circumstances demanded heroism over compliance. The Americans who survived their underground captivity carried this lesson into their post-war lives, applying the patience and adaptability they had learned in the hidden cellar to civilian challenges that might otherwise have defeated them. Technical Sergeant Kowalski's manufacturing business employed over 200 people by the 1960s, creating prosperity for communities throughout the Midwest while applying engineering principles learned during his months of enforced innovation beneath a French barn. Lieutenant Kravitz's airline career spanned 3 decades, during which he trained hundreds of pilots in the calm persistence required for safe civilian aviation. His approach to pilot training emphasized the importance of remaining functional under pressure, a skill he had mastered during months of absolute silence while German patrols searched for evidence of his survival. The other crew members similarly integrated their underground experience into productive civilian lives, crediting their captivity with teaching them capabilities they had never imagined possessing. Their success became its own form of resistance against the forces that had tried to destroy them, proving that human creativity and cooperation could triumph over systems designed to crush individual initiative and mutual aid. The story spread through veteran networks and family traditions, inspiring new generations to understand that heroism often required sustained commitment rather than momentary courage, and that the most effective resistance to evil often happened in hidden places where anonymous people made impossible decisions. The legacy of that October morning in 1943 extended far beyond the individuals directly involved, influencing military doctrine, resistance training, and civilian emergency procedures for decades after the war ended. The detailed documentation of Cyprian's hiding system became required reading at intelligence schools throughout the Allied nations, demonstrating how civilian creativity could achieve results that exceeded military capabilities. The engineering innovations developed to sustain hidden populations influenced post-war disaster preparedness programs, providing models for community survival techniques that could function during extended emergency periods. Most significantly, the example challenged assumptions about the relationship between military and civilian populations during wartime, proving that ordinary citizens possessed capabilities that could make decisive differences in military outcomes. The story became part of training curricula for intelligence officers, demonstrating the importance of civilian cooperation and the potential for agricultural communities to support extended operations behind enemy lines. But perhaps the most important legacy was the proof that individual conscience could triumph over systematic oppression when supported by careful planning and sustained commitment. Cyprian had chosen to risk everything for strangers because he recognized their humanity despite their foreign uniforms and unfamiliar language. That choice had required months of sustained courage as German investigations intensified and the risks of discovery multiplied with each passing week. The success of his decision validated the principle that moral obligation could provide reliable guidance even when practical calculations suggested compliance with evil authority. The Americans who owed their lives to that choice carried this lesson into their post-war careers, applying the principles of mutual aid and sacrificial courage to civilian challenges that shaped their communities for generations. Their example inspired similar commitments to human dignity over personal safety, creating ripple effects that extended far beyond the immediate participants in the original drama. The question that remains unanswered after more than 8 decades is whether contemporary society retains the capacity for such sustained moral courage. Would modern farmers risk everything to hide strangers whose survival depended on their willingness to defy authority and endure months of constant danger? Would ordinary citizens today possess the engineering creativity and logistical persistence required to sustain such operations against systematic investigation by modern surveillance technology? The technical challenges that Cyprian solved through improvisation and determination would be exponentially more difficult in an era of thermal imaging, electronic surveillance, and computerized analysis of consumption patterns. But the fundamental choice would remain the same: whether to prioritize personal safety or moral obligation when confronted with human suffering that could be alleviated through individual action. Cyprian's example suggests that ordinary people possess extraordinary capabilities when circumstances demand heroism over compliance, but also that such capabilities require activation through conscious choice rather than automatic response. The Americans who survived their underground captivity often reflected that their rescue depended not only on Cyprian's initial decision, but also on his sustained commitment to see that decision through despite escalating risks and mounting pressure. This combination of moral clarity and practical persistence created results that neither element could have achieved independently, demonstrating that effective heroism requires both principles and capabilities. The story challenges contemporary audiences to consider their own capacity for similar choices, recognizing that heroism often demands sustained commitment rather than momentary courage, and that the most important battles are frequently fought in hidden places by anonymous people who never seek recognition for their sacrifice. The legacy of Prairie Rose and the farmer who saved her crew remains a testament to humanity's capacity for transcendent love and a reminder that individual conscience can triumph over systematic evil when supported by careful planning and unwavering determination. Comment below and share this story, so others remember what courage really means when ordinary people face impossible choices and find extraordinary strength in the simple decision to protect human life regardless of uniform, nationality, or personal cost.